Good afternoon, everyone. It's a really loud mic. I'm going to try it one more time. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I see some folks in the back that are standing up, and I know that you're sneaking out of one training so you can catch the beginning of this. I guarantee you won't want to go back to your training. You want to stay here, but I know you have to do what you have to do. So I'm just going to introduce the speaker for this afternoon. We're going to ask the people that are on video if you can please put your satellite thing on silent or mute. Awesome. And I just wanted to take the time to welcome everyone. You know me, my name is Baroness Martin, and I'm the Director of Diversity here at RHD. And this is a real treat on this afternoon. Some of you will be challenged, some of you will be just elated, some folks might leave with an attitude. And guess what? Oh well. How about that? That's how I'm feeling right now. Oh well. How about that? So, the speaker on this afternoon, the theme is Beyond Diversity. And there are many people in here today that have heard this man's name, that have actually heard him speak. And that's why you're here on this afternoon. There are some people here because they've been asked to come. Some people are interested to hear what he has to say. And some people are here because I asked you to come or made you come. It's okay. Thank you for coming because I made you come. There are a couple of people here that I actually paid. I'll hit you later. And just glad you're here. So Tim Wise is our guest this afternoon, so we can give him a little applause before I introduce him. Tim Wise, start from the beginning, whom scholar and philosopher Cornel West calls a vanilla brother in the tradition of abolitionist John Brown, is among the nation's most prominent anti-racist essayists and educators. He has spent the past 25 years speaking to audiences in all 50 states on over 1,000 college and high school campuses, at hundreds of professional and academic conferences, and to community groups across the nation. He has also lectured internationally in Canada and Bermuda and has trained corporate, government, law enforcement, and medical industry professionals on methods for dismantling racism in their institutions. Wise's anti-racism work traces back to his days as a college activist in the 1980s, fights for divestment from economic sanctions against apartheid in South Africa. And after graduation, he threw himself into social justice efforts full-time as a youth coordinator and associate director of the Louisiana Coalition Against Racism and Nazism, the largest of the many groups organized in the early 1990s to defeat the political candidates of white supremacist and former Ku Klux Klan leader David Duke. From there, he became a community organizer in New Orleans public housing and a policy analyst for a children's advocacy group focused on combating poverty and economic inequity. He has served as an adjunct professor at Smith College School of Social Work in Northampton, Massachusetts, and from 1999 to 2003 was an advisor to the Fisk University Race Relations Institute in Nashville, Tennessee. Wise, he's written many books and done so many other phenomenal things. He graduated from Tulane University in 1990 and received anti-racism training from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond in New Orleans. I'm not going to take up any more of his time. We want every bit that we can possibly get. Let's welcome RHD Tim Wise.
So first of all, I want to apologize to everyone who's having to look at my backside for the next hour or so. This is weird. Like they came in, they had it all set up, it was good, it was in the middle, and I was like, nah, I want to configure it so I can see everybody. And if they had told me that a bunch of folks would be looking at my ass for it, I I would have just said leave it. So I apologize ahead of time, but thank you all for looking over my shoulder and freaking me out, and the rest of y'all for being here. Is everybody good today?
Yes.
Good. Well, I make no promises about whether you'll feel the same way when we're done, but I'm going to do what I can to help move this thing along a little bit. And by this thing, I just mean this conversation about race and racism and institutional inequality. I want to make sure before I get rolling with that you can hear me okay in the back. I'm not holding the mic because it's sort of a little bit of a pain. I speak with my hands. I'm afraid I'm going to throw it over there and hit the wall. So I'm gonna try to put it down and still be heard. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. All right, good. If you can't, let me know. I'll pick it up and I'll just try not to throw it, and we'll move on from there. For those who know me and know my work, and I know some of you do, some of you have heard me before, you know that I'm not known for my cheery optimism about this country or about the culture in which we live. I'm not known for my optimism about where we're headed as a society. I'm not cynical, right? But I'm not optimistic. I'm not cynical because I can't afford to be. Because I don't think cynicism is usually very helpful if we're trying to make the world a better place, but also because I have children and I can't afford to be cynical. I have 2 teenage daughters. You can pray for me later. As the father of children, I have a vested interest in believing, even if it has to be somewhat agnostic on my part, that change is possible. So I'm not known for optimism, but because I am trying to be optimistic for my kids now, for my kids, not for me, for my kids, I have decided to try to tease out a silver lining from the incredibly problematic storm clouds that I think we all see gathering in our society right now. And I gotta be honest, I'm not even sure if I believe this bullshit that I'm about to hit you with. I don't even know if what I'm about to say convinces me, but I'm gonna say it, I'm gonna say this persuasively, and then y'all can decide, yeah, that's some bullshit, I don't buy that, because like I said, I might not either, but I'm just trying to be optimistic. So here's my little sliver of optimism and hope, right? For those of us who do anti-racism work, civil rights work, equity work, the last 8 years have been about what? Have been about trying to convince people, and particularly white people, that this thing called racism is still a thing about which we need to speak. That has been the gig for 8 damn years, trying to explain to my people, those of us called white, that this is real. Trying to explain that people of color are not seeing things when they talk about racism. Trying to prove at the most basic, introductory, remedial 101 level, that this is even a conversation we have to have. That has been exhausting, as I'm sure everyone in this room, particularly of color, can attest. So here's the good news. The good news is we don't have to do that shit anymore because we got over the 101 a while back now, and some things happened that have put in very clear perspective for some folks who maybe were in the dark before, that this is real. So the whole, we got a black president, therefore we don't have any problem, yeah, done. We're not in that space anymore. So the good news is maybe we can now focus in and actually be able to see some things that otherwise we weren't seeing. Like I said, I'm not sure I buy it because it's still pretty bad news, right? The bad news is we're seeing it more blatantly because it's more blatant, and that's never a good thing, but at least it helps to crystallize some things, and we don't have to hold hands, and we don't have to cajole, and we don't have to beg people to believe us when we say that this thing is real. But now there is some bad news that comes with that good news about being able to focus in. The bad news, other than just the fact that it is the result of some overt stuff that we're seeing all around the country right now in our politics and elsewhere. The other bad news is it is easy when you start to see the blatant stuff, the obvious stuff, the uptick in hate crime activity, the viral videos where, I know you've seen some of these, where white folks are losing their mind because they got bad service at a Starbucks from a black barista. Right? Y'all saw this video, there's this white guy right after the election, got soy milk, he asked for 2% or some shit, and they gave him soy milk, and he went off, right? He just went off, and he went off, called this black barista all kinds of racial slurs, and then felt that he wanted to throw in, by the way, I voted for Trump, what do you have to say about that? What the hell did that have to do with his coffee? Had nothing to do with anything. But he just wanted to make sure this black woman knew that he, this white guy, had voted for Trump. And he starts screaming about how it's reverse discrimination and he's racially oppressed. Okay, pro tip, if you think that being racially oppressed is getting bad service at a coffee shop, you are clearly having a pretty sweet life. And you have proven beyond anything I can do that white privilege is a real thing, right? I don't even have to give another speech, write another book, write another essay, do anything on social media, because if that is what you think oppression looks like, being given bad service in a retail establishment, you clearly have never been oppressed, right? Side note, that wasn't even in my notes, I just felt like saying it. So all of this blatant stuff, here's the thing, we can laugh about it, we can make fun of that guy, we can point at him, like I just did, because it was fun to do, right? It was good, but we can point at people like that, or we can look at the president and some of his cronies, and we can look at the people who say the blatant kind of stuff that we all know has been bubbling up more lately, and then it becomes easy for us to feel smug, the rest of us now. We're smug and self-satisfied that that's not us. We're not like that. We're better than that. Right? That's those people over there, and particularly those of us who are in what we call loosely the helping professions, that is to say human services work, right? Or people who are teachers, people who are social workers, people who are counselors, even lots of folks who are doctors and nurses, because they're in the business of quote unquote helping, right? They can become self-satisfied and smug that they're good people doing good things. They would never hurt anybody, right? Racist are what those people are, right? Sexist, that's those people. Classist, that's those people, right? There's the bad folks, but that's not us. And you heard in the introduction a little bit about my background. I started out doing this work in Louisiana in 1990 when David Duke, former Klansman, white supremacist, overt Nazi, ran for Senate, then for governor. And when those campaigns were over, and Duke had been defeated, but I beg to remind you, not by much, in 1990, although he lost the US Senate race, he got 6 out of 10 white people to vote for him. And it wasn't because they didn't know he was a Nazi, right? Everybody knew that he was a Nazi. There were children in utero that knew that David Duke was a Nazi, right? They got the news, right? Everybody knew, and yet 625,000 white people voted for him. And when it was over with, I remember sitting there along with many of my colleagues, and we had to really figure out what separated us from them. Because see, it's easy to be smug and say, well, I didn't vote for the Nazi, I'm a better person, right? But what really separated me from the 625,000 white people that voted for the Nazi? 625,000 white and like 2 black guys. Because there's always a couple, right? There's always a couple. There's always going to be a couple of folks that just do some crazy, inexplicable shit. But it was 625,000. I mean, you know, it's just, that's the odds, right? Somebody's going to do something nuts. But 625,000 white folks, and I wasn't one of them. But I'm trying to be not smug because I sit there and I think to myself, what makes me different than them? Right? Why was I not one of them? Well, I mean, there's one obvious reason. I'm Jewish. That means I know not to vote for the Nazi. So there's that. There's that, right? But the other thing is real simple, and even that's connected to the Jewish thing, which is, it's just about how I was raised, right? And I didn't have any control over that. I had certain experiences growing up, right? And they sent me down a particular path. And those 625,000 white folks that voted for the Nazi, they had some different experiences that sent them down a different path. And they weren't to blame for the stuff that they experienced, over which they didn't have control. And I didn't deserve any credit for the stuff that I'd experienced. So I started thinking about this thing I'm talking about right now, this idea that we can't afford to make this line that says good people on this side, bad people on this side. Because I had just graduated from Tulane University, which was an institution that at the time I graduated from it still didn't have any African American undergraduate faculty, which means I was implicated in a system of inequality and got my degree from a white supremacist institution, right? I mean, that's just being honest. I lived in a city, New Orleans, where the sheriff of a neighboring parish had announced the very month that I moved to town that he was instructing his deputies to stop all black men driving what he called rinky-dink automobiles in white neighborhoods. And that meant I was privileged as an automotive driver in that space. I could go wherever I wanted without fear of profiling. So I was in it, even if I wasn't responsible or to blame for it. I'm still part of it because I'm implicated every day that I live in that space and receive those advantages. So this bright line, good people, bad people thing, right, gets us in a lot of trouble. And And those of us who do human services work or the quote unquote helping professions or whatever else, right? We need to get over our good people problem. Right? And I say we because I've been in that role. I mean, part of the intro, as you heard, I did community organizing with a nonprofit that did children and family advocacy, did policy research for them, and that was an organization that also provided child care referral with the federal contract. I mean, did direct human service provision work, and we had to have this conversation regularly. Right? We as an organization were trained and required training through the People's Institute for that reason, right? To make sure that when we did the work, we did it with some level of integrity, because it's so easy to fall back into that idea of I'm a good person doing good things. I'm certainly not in this work for the money, because I know nobody gets rich doing this work, right? And so in a sense, if we allow ourselves to believe that, then we're in serious trouble, because there are lots of ways that racism, properly understood, can be manifested in our institutions with or without bad intentionality. When we do the good person, bad person thing, what we're doing is we're looking for the racist. I'm personally not very interested in finding the racist, right? Because to some extent, if we've been raised in a racist society, we've all internalized some of that mess, so trying to find the racist is like trying to find the air breather, right? We're everywhere. Like that sort of comes with the territory. We all internalize it. White folks internalize white supremacy. People of color internalize white supremacy and turn it against themselves, right? Because it's everywhere, just like men are going to internalize patriarchy and misogyny. Women are going to internalize that and use it against themselves. Poor folks are going to internalize the logic of the class system just like rich folks are, and they're going to turn it against themselves. I'll have more to talk about when it comes to that in just a second. So my point is, not really interested in racists so much as racism. And racism, by definition, often involves racists, don't get me wrong, but as a system, it doesn't necessarily have to, at least not in the formal sense, right? Because isms are what? By definition, they're two things. They're ideologies and systems. Just like capitalism, socialism, communism, fascism, authoritarianism. Those are ways of thinking, but more importantly, they're ways of doing, right? They're ways of constructing systems, institutions. What do systems have that make them systems? They have policies, practices, procedures. They have a narrative. They have a history. They have a function, right? So when we start talking about racism as a systemic or an institutional force, we don't have to find any racists. There can be no racists in the formal, overt sense and still have racism. Now, how is that? How is that? Because that seems counterintuitive. How can you have racism without racist, as Eduardo Bonilla Silva at Duke says in his book by that name? Well, there are a lot of ways you can. Think about this in the context of employment. I talk to employers all the time, sometimes in the nonprofit sector, sometimes in corporate America, and I ask them, how do you make your hiring decisions? Like, what do you do? Well, we take out advertisements online in the paper, we post things around different job boards, and I asked to look at some of those ads, right? And they always say the kind of experience they're looking for, right? And they say 4 to 6 years, 2 to 3 years, 8 to 10 years, whatever, right? And I always ask them, well, why 4 to 6? Why 6 to 8? Why 8 to 10? Why not 2 years, 3 months, 4 days, and 5 hours to 5 years and 2 minutes? Like, why did y'all settle on that? And not once have I had any of them come back and say, well, now that you asked, smartass, here's a study we did that proves that we have to have exactly that much, because they've never done that, right? They just are making a guess, usually based on what the last guy had to have. Here's the problem with that, right? If I'm putting up formal credentials that say you need to have X amount of experience, but I'm putting those credentials on top of a job search process that takes place in a society where some folks have been able to get in the pipeline earlier and accumulate all that time, then by definition, I'm perpetuating inequality. Now that sounds like the most qualification, merit-based hiring process possible. We're gonna hire based on who's more qualified, and we're going to say who's more qualified based on who has more experience. But here's the deal. If I have a 5-lap head start on you in an 8-lap race, I'm supposed to cross the finish line first, right? That's the point of the head start. In fact, if I have a 5-lap head start and I end up only 3 laps ahead, I'm pretty damn slow. I'm not the fastest runner, and you would not want me on your track team. Same thing is true in the work context. You say 6 years experience, 4 years, oh, this person's got 15, this person only has 9, and therefore this person is the one who gets the job. Well, the problem is that that person who has 9, or that person who has 3, or that person who has 5, but maybe not quite in the exact same type of job, right? Maybe that's where they are because they got on the track late, right? Maybe they didn't even know where the track was until the other person or group of people were already 5 laps up. So see, we have to realize sometimes the things that we use just every day that we don't think about, the processes that we use to hire folks themselves can perpetuate racial inequality, gender inequality, class inequality. There was a study 3 years ago written up in the New York Times found that almost half of the new jobs since the recession are being filled by way of letters of recommendation written by existing employees on behalf of friends who were trying to get a job at that place, right? So if you know John over in the HR department, you all of a sudden have a much better chance of being hired than someone who doesn't. If you know Matt over in accounting, right, you have a much better chance. If you don't know anybody that can write you a specific letter, right, then you're scratched from half the jobs. Now explain to me, how is that any different, right, from us? Because, you know, we know what the research says, who gets hurt by that. It's disproportionately benefiting white folks, disproportionately men, disproportionately affluent folks who went to the quote-unquote right colleges. So if you're a person of color, a woman of any color, working class of any race, you are essentially scratched from half the jobs. How is that any different from going back to a pre-civil rights era when they just said you couldn't have the job? What's the difference? I mean, practically speaking, there's no difference. Your odds have just been cut in half. It might as well have a no black folk need apply, no Latinx folk need apply, no women of whatever color or race or ethnicity need apply, no working class or poor folk. Might as well just have a sign that says it because the outcome is virtually the same. You know what the only real difference is? The only real difference is you put a sign up and you can get sued for that. But if you hire people based on networking, the courts say you can't. See, they've allowed that kind of racial disparity. They allow that kind of gender disparity. That's not what they call actionable in court. You can't sue over that. So this embedded way in which racism gets perpetuated isn't even something you can get recompense for, because the courts say it's all right, which means our institutions have to be vigilant to make sure that we're breaking through that process, that we're reevaluating the kind of credentials that we ask for certain jobs, right? That we're critically assessing whether you really need this, or maybe you need some other skills that don't show up on a resume, and which sometimes marginalized folks have in larger numbers, right? We've actually done this research on college admissions, because that's another area where connections matter, right? A lot of people get into colleges, especially selective colleges, based on the fact their dad went there, their grandparents went there. We know who that's going to benefit disproportionately are going to be wealthier white folks, right? And there's certainly true that at elite colleges, you know, kids that have gone to the wealthier schools, whether they're private or wealthy public schools, are probably going to have the higher test scores because they got exposed to the material, right? So in education, we know that you can perpetuate racial inequality, racism systemically by giving standardized tests to unstandardized kids, right? Who had unstandardized curriculum, unstandardized teacher training, unstandardized resources, unstandardized access to honors and AP classes. And then they take the test and they don't do as well, and we act shocked. And we suggest that, well, they just must not be as qualified. So then that becomes a gatekeeping mechanism for the next level of schooling. And we do that in ways that no other country on earth does. What's interesting, right, is that they've done some studies that have actually found that those SAT scores and all the things that we use that perpetuate racial inequity, gender inequity, class inequity, have almost nothing to do with success. Almost nothing to do with success. How you do on that SAT, the ACT, the GRE, the LSAT. I was talking to the New Jersey Bar Association yesterday, and I made this point to them, right, that there was actually, because these are all lawyers, right? These are lawyers who have an investment in believing that their high LSAT scores are why they're so damn successful, right? And the only study I've ever seen on the subject was done at the University of Michigan back in the 90s. It found that there was an inverse relationship between your LSAT score and your professional success and feelings of accomplishment. In other words, the higher your score, the more your career sucked wind, and the lower your score, the more you liked your job and the more successful you were. So if anything, not only are the high scorers not the most competent, sometimes they're the least competent, right? And one of the reasons is that the folks who maybe didn't score as high maybe had to overcome some stuff that other people didn't. Maybe they've got some skills, perseverance, stick-to-itiveness, the ability to overcome obstacles, which actually are better at predicting your overall life success than your ability to fill in bubbles on a standardized test chart, which has no relationship to anything, right? So in a sense, we better start reevaluating our credentials and what we ask for, because when schools have done that, they have this thing, some of y'all have probably heard of the Millennium Scholarships that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation created many years ago. These are aimed at students of color, disproportionately who did not have the highest SAT scores or the highest quote-unquote academic credentials, right? But the questions they ask on that scholarship application ask about things like perseverance. What are the obstacles that you faced and what were your strategies for overcoming them? Do you have a network of friends and family to which you can turn in a crisis, and how have you done that before? What are some of the demonstrated leadership skills in your community that you possess and value that maybe other people wouldn't know about? Things like that. And what they find is that the students who answer those questions well and who score highly on that kind of an index, which is called a non-cognitive instrument, non-cognitive variable instrument, right? The folks that do well on that actually do better in college at the very same schools than the people who had the high SAT scores and the high grades. So maybe racism is reinforced, maybe classism is reinforced, maybe sexism is reinforced by way of some of the basic policies, practices, and procedures that we do every day that we don't question, that we don't interrogate. Not only that, though, what also perpetuates our racism in our institutions, and by that I just mean racial inequity, significant institutional racial disparity, is this mistaken belief that we sometimes have, especially those of us in the helping profession. Because see, the thing about those of us who want to help, God love us, right? The problem with those of us, I mean, honestly, the problem with us, again, I'm putting myself in the middle of this because we're all just here to help. Because we just love people so damn much, The problem is that sometimes we look at inequalities. We look at things like poverty. We look at things like unemployment. We look at things like homelessness. We look at things like educational failure. We look at things like disproportionate crime in certain communities. We look at all these indices of failure, and we start from the proposition that they signify that the system isn't working and we need to do something to make the system work better, right? In other words, the system's broken and we're going to fix it. But see, if you think the system is broken because it's creating those outcomes, you are not paying attention. The system isn't broken, the system is giving you exactly what the system was set up to give you, right? And if you start with the idea that it's broken, you'll be lost. Here's what I mean by that. Right after Katrina, I'd been out of New Orleans at that point for 9 years, but right afterward, it was impactful to me, even though I wasn't there, because a lot of friends lost their homes. I know people who died. I know people who got uprooted, certainly never made it back, right? And right afterward, you'll recall, Spike Lee did that film, When the Levees Broke, really good film, but one part of it rubbed me the wrong way. It's this part where Spike was being interviewed in the film. He also was interviewed in the news around that time, and this became part of the movie. And he said, what happened with Katrina was a system failure of monumental proportions. And that was where he lost me, because the only way that you could think what happened to black and brown folk and poor folk of all colors in the New Orleans area was a system failure is if you think the system had been serving those folks every day before the storm hit. That's the only way you could look at it as a failure. If the system was not set up to serve you, and then it proceeds not to serve you, that is not system failure. That is the system succeeding on the terms that it was created for. Right? And the people of New Orleans understood that getting displaced, that wasn't new. The only thing new about it was that it was a levee breaking that made that happen. It had previously been done to put the I-10 through the Treme, the oldest free black neighborhood in the United States, right, which they uprooted, tore down hundreds of black-owned businesses, thousands of black-owned apartments and homes in order to put up an interstate that would allow white folks to get out to the suburbs where only we could live. That was displacement, right? When they built the Superdome, that was on the grounds of a black neighborhood, but they had to put a Superdome up so the Saints could play really bad football for decades. Right? And they knocked down that neighborhood. So displacement for people of color is not new, it's normative. Right? Black folks know they wouldn't even be here but for an act of displacement. Indigenous people know that they've been displaced from the beginning. Asian American folk, particularly Chinese, brought here to work on the railroads to build the transcontinental economy. Latinx folks displaced when we stole half of their country in a war of aggression. So displacement is not new. The only thing that was new about it was on TV. Right? And all of a sudden, white folks got to see some of it. And for about 72 hours, we were sympathetic. And then about 96 hours in, we turned, didn't we? We turned and we said, why didn't they leave? Why didn't they get out? Why didn't they get on those school buses and drive into the night? Right? They're irresponsible. And then the rhetoric came that they were all sitting around waiting for their check at the beginning of the month. And that was the rhetoric, even though at the time of the storm, there were only 2,800 households in the entire city of New Orleans that were receiving cash assistance. 2,800 households, they were receiving, by the way, a median amount of $147 a month. I don't think folks are going to wait around for that when the water is coming up to their roof, right? 2,800 households out of hundreds of thousands of households, but that was the narrative. Because we've decided to pathologize poor people, we pathologize the communities where they live, so that's part of it as well. But most importantly, we think that the system is failing. We must understand the system is doing what it was intended to do. Our school systems are a perfect example of this. I asked teachers, particularly new teachers, when they just started in the classroom, why did you want to get into education? They always say, well, because I believe education is the great equalizer. For real? Where? In this country? The hell country you live in? Because in the country I live in, that's nonsense. When has education ever been the great equalizer? Not only has it never done that, first of all, just in case anybody's under the illusion that it is, let's be clear. Black folks with a college degree, almost twice as likely as white folks with a degree to be out of work, regardless of major, I should point out. So clearly it's not equalizing. Latino folks with a college degree, 50% more likely to be out of work than white folks with a degree. So it's not equalizing. Asian Pacific American and Pacific Islanders with a degree, 21% more likely than whites with a degree to be out of work. So clearly it's not equalizing. Our indigenous brothers and sisters, 2/3 more likely to be unemployed even when they have a degree than white folks with a degree. So obviously it isn't actually performing that function, but understand it was never meant to. The school system was supposed to produce inequality, not equality. You don't believe me? Think that sounds hyperbolic, extreme, radical? Let's just break it down. We'll go back to the late 1700s. Thomas Jefferson, who is one of white people's favorite white people. Thomas Jefferson. Not all of us, but a lot of us. I gather a lot of people respect him. Here's what Thomas Jefferson said in Notes on the State of Virginia. He said, and understand, Thomas Jefferson wasn't just a quote-unquote founding father, right? He was also considered for his day a forward-thinking, progressive educator. He actually had educational theories that people talked about. He founded the University of Virginia, right? He was viewed as this forward-thinking educational theorist. What did he say in Notes on the State of Virginia? He said, what we need is 6 years of compulsory schooling. And he was just talking about white people. He didn't mean that for black folks. He didn't mean that for native folk, right? He meant that just for white folks. 6 years worth of compulsory schooling so that we can, these are his words, rake a few geniuses from the rubbish. I want you to help me with that phrase for a minute, because what does that mean? It means, first of all, and newsflash to white people, Thomas Jefferson didn't think much of your white ass either. Like, he didn't think much of most white people either, right? He just basically called most of us trash. He just said, we're going to give the white folks basically 6 years of education so we can figure out the handful of geniuses, rake them from the rubble, make the rubble work for the rest of us. So what he was saying was education is not for equality. It's not as a great equalizer. We're going to use this as an unequalizer. That's its function. He's announcing that. See, when somebody tells you what it's about, believe them, right? Fast forward to the early 1900s, Woodrow Wilson, who of course became president, but before he was president of Princeton. He too was viewed at the time as a very forward-thinking educational theorist. Not quite on the level of Dewey and some others, but he was up there. He was considered forward-thinking in his approach to schooling. But what did Wilson say? Wilson said, sort of echoing what Jefferson had said over 100 years earlier, Wilson said, what we need is one group of people to prepare themselves for the receipt of a liberal education. That was the term they used to use for a college education in those days. And he said, but what we need by necessity in this and every other society is a much larger group of people to forego the privilege of a liberal education so they can prepare themselves for the performance of certain difficult manual tasks. So what was he saying? He was saying a small group, the geniuses, a larger group, the rubbish, and we're going to use education as a way to distinguish one from the other and perpetuate inequality. right? Not equality, inequality. And again, Wilson was only talking about white folks, so you know what their intentions were with regard to peoples of color, right? Fast forward again, early 2000s. George W. Bush administration, they've just passed No Child Left Behind. I turn on one of those Sunday shows, and William Bennett is on. Some of y'all old enough to remember, William Bennett was the former drug czar in the Reagan administration. He was also, until recently, the least qualified Secretary of Education in the history of the Department of Education. He has been bumped from that perch but he's still a close second. Now he's still up there, close second. But there he is on television, former Secretary of Education, and he's being asked by the host. The host says, "What's the biggest problem in education today?" And I thought, man, that's a heavy question, right? Like, it's so heavy that even though I have some thoughts about it, if you ask me that on national television, I would probably ask, hey, can we go to a break for a minute and give me a couple minutes? Because I'd like to think about it. I don't just want to blurt out some nonsense. Let me think about it, and I'll get back to you, right? And so I was sort of thinking maybe Bill Bennett, will do that. We'll demonstrate the humility necessary to take a break, take a breath, take a sip of water, something. No, he doesn't do any of that. Bill Bennett was ready with his answer, and I was riveted, and he says, well, the biggest problem is we have too many people going to college. Let's break that down. All right? Break that down in the context of what Thomas Jefferson had said before and what Woodrow Wilson had said before. Because what does he mean? See, now here's the thing. I got to be honest. I was trying to give him some slack. I don't know why, because he's Bill Bennett, but I was trying to give him some slack. Because you know how sometimes when you're saying something to somebody, your throat will catch, right? You get a little thing in your throat and you have to take a sip of water because you're starting to choke. So I thought maybe when he said too many people were going to college, like that happened to him. Like maybe there was something coming after that. Maybe he had like an internal ellipses, the 3 dots, right there in his mouth. Or he had like an M dash or a comma or a semicolon or some shit. He had more to say. Like maybe he was going to say too many people are going to college, ... who can't afford it because it's just unaffordable now. Like, I would have gone along with that. Or maybe he was going to say, we have too many people going to college, ... who aren't really ready to go because we've screwed up K-12 so badly by not funding it equitably. Like, I would have been down with that. Nah, there was no ellipses in this guy's throat, man. There was no comma, no nothing but a period at the end of the sentence. That's all he meant to say. Too many people going to college. And they didn't ask him, who are these people? But I know. Who do you think he's talking about? Do you think he's talking about the rich and mediocre children of rich and mediocre parents who came from rich and mediocre grandparents? Because I've known a lot of rich and mediocre people who went to prep schools and they got to go to Ivy League schools. They used to be able to get a gentleman's C at Yale and go on to become president. And then go back to Yale and brag about being a C student at the commencement address. I'll leave it to your imagination which president that was. I can tell you which one it wasn't, right? Because I'm fairly confident no black president could go back and brag about being a mediocre student. So I think we know who I'm talking about, right? So I don't think Bill Bennett is saying that the children who go to Choate and Groton and various prep schools, right, or in Philly who go to Episcopal or wherever the hell, right, that they don't deserve to go to college. Too many of them are taking up slots in college. We know they're going to college, right, because they're the geniuses who've been raked from the rubbish. They're the ones that Wilson and Jefferson were talking about. So even though he doesn't specify who he means, you know who he means. He means working class folks who are gaining access in greater numbers than they have before, not enough, but greater than the past, and people of color who are gaining access in greater numbers than before. He doesn't have to say it, it's obvious. It is, for lack of a better way to understand it, the mentality of the slave owner. Because what was the mentality of the slave owner? Their mentality was, if they all learn to read, who's going to pick this cotton? Right? So now, if everybody goes to college, who's going to pick up my garbage in my alley every Wednesday? Because see, if everybody gets a college degree, the folks who do that job, they'll think they're too good for that. How do I know that? Because I think I'm too good for that, apparently, because I got a college degree. So I wouldn't even know where the hell to take my garbage. Don't even know where the landfill is, where the recycle facility is. I got no clue. And if it's not for those 3 guys that come down every Wednesday making $19,500 a year with crappy benefits, if they decide not to show up for work for 6 months, we got plague on my block. Man, people are dropping dead, falling out, right? They do the most important job in the community, far more important than me and the stockbroker that lives 4 doors down. The stockbroker doesn't show up for 6 weeks, life will go on. Nobody's gonna miss him. Somebody else will trade that shit. But if those three guys don't come in, man, people are dying. We got rats the size of cars running around my neighborhood, right? But we have a system that's predicated on the idea that even some of the most important work, we gotta pay like crap because they don't have a degree, right? And we don't want them to have a degree because then they won't do that work. If you have an economy, a labor market that's rooted in the division of labor and inequality and people having certain job slots, you gotta have an education system that feeds that job market. You can't have an education system about equity if you have an economy about inequity, right? Because if you got to end up with this economy, you got to have an educational system that provides you the raw material. Right? So if you're waiting at the end of that conveyor belt at the sausage factory, and you're surprised that you keep getting sausage, right? And you're down at the end of the conveyor belt, you're like, where the hell are my chicken nuggets? You clearly did not read the sign outside that told you it was a sausage factory. Don't be shocked. If the system was predicated on inequality, don't be surprised when you see inequality. And this is an important mentality because we can't do our service work if we think that we're trying to fix failure. We can only do our service work properly if we understand that we're trying to transform systems, right? Not fix the machine, alter the machine. Not, because, you know, it's like, to put it in app terms, technology terms, inequality is not a glitch, it's a feature. Right? That shit was built into the app. It's not, there's not going to be a bug fix that you can download and say, oh, I got it together now, I patched my app. No. This is a feature of the system. And if you understand that, the whole conversation changes. Right? Because it changes where we place the emphasis on who has the deficit. See, a lot of times our service work is rooted, whether we want to admit it or not, in a fundamental deficit model. Right? Where the deficit is identified as adhering to and in the communities we serve. As in, they have a deficit and we're going to fix them. We're going to help them become job ready, become school ready. We're going to empower them individually. In other words, they are the ones with the deficit. We are the ones with the money. We are going to come in and fix the problem. But the problem with that model, right, is that it ignores the institutional systemic deficit that we suffer from that created that in the first place. Because who has the deficit, right? The one who is homeless, or the society that says housing ought to be a commodity no different than a big screen TV. Either you get it or you don't. If you don't, too bad. Like, who has the deficit? The one who doesn't have enough food, or the society that said that food ought to be a commodity rather than a human right? Who is the one with the deficit? The one that doesn't have affordable health care, or the society that said medicine is a commodity no different than a smartphone, you either get it or you don't? See, if we start with the assumption that the deficit is ours, not theirs, ours, then the entire contour of our work changes. The narrative of our work changes. The focus of our work changes. The way that we write our grants change. The nonprofits that we assist and help incubate, that changes because they got to come with some intentionality around the same kind of counter-narrative. It can't be about patching up the victims. It has to be about stopping victimization. And that's a very, very different conversation because you know what we're up against. I would say the biggest single contributor to racism, institutionally and attitudinally, is not, you know, it's not this thing that they used to say back in the day in the 70s. I remember there's a group, some of you will remember it used to be called the National Conference of Christians and Jews, and then it became the National Conference for Community Justice, I think was what they changed their name to. They used to have these slick advertisements, right? Their slogan, which they borrowed and sort of changed a little bit from the musical South Pacific, but their slogan was, you have to be taught how to hate, right? And I remember seeing that, and I really couldn't with that slogan, because when I heard it, right, you know, it gives the impression that people learn to be racist because their dad sits them down and says, don't like those people, and blah, 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 and you should hate them, and, you know, they're horrible. Well, I mean, that happens, right? Certainly people get taught by their parents, their grandparents, and friends, and neighbors, and whatever, various things. But I always felt it was too simplistic because it ignored the way that we teach, sometimes not by what we say, but what we don't say, right? Or we teach things that we didn't know we were teaching, right? In other words, it's not always the direct lesson plan. Sometimes there's a hidden lesson. There's a hidden curriculum. And in this country, we've all been exposed to one idea above all, that I think is probably more important to sustaining racism than any other idea. And it's not the overt instruction in white supremacy. It's not overt stereotypes and racism against people of color. You know what it is? It's the fundamental guiding principle, the most central narrative to America itself. It's our secular gospel. It's our foundational creation myth. It's Genesis 1:1 of Americanism. And what is that? Genesis 1:1 of Americanism is the idea, quite unique to our country in many ways, that as long as you're willing to work hard, you can make it. Right? This notion of rugged individualism and meritocracy. Right? The old nations of Europe didn't play around with that mess. Everybody knew that that wasn't true. You were either related to the king or you weren't. And if you were a peasant, you were going to be a damn peasant until you overthrew the king. It was understood. You weren't going to work your way up. You weren't going to double down on your work. You weren't going to do a damn thing. And everybody understood it. But in this country, we have cultivated since the colonial era and certainly since the founding, the idea that in America, all things are possible. So if you just work hard, you can make it, which means if you made it, it's because you're the best. And if you didn't make it, it's your own damn fault. Now, if we teach that, and we do, and we've all been exposed to it, right? What does that do to our ability to challenge inequality? Well, it doesn't do much, does it? Because what it does is it reinforces and rationalizes inequality. If I'm raised as a child in a society where I don't understand the systemic injustice, but I'm told every day that wherever you end up is all about your own effort, then I'll come to look down at the people at the bottom. And I'll praise the people at the top. I remember a couple years back driving through, our daughters are dancers, and at the time they were both dancing with a particular dance company downtown in Nashville, and so from their school to the studio was about an 8-minute drive on surface roads, and this particular way that we would go takes us right through public housing in Nashville. Right? Particular public housing community, just a few minutes drive from their school. And so we've been making this drive like every day for a year, but on this particular day, my youngest daughter decided to ask a question about this, right? She looked around, we were at a red light, stopped, waiting for it to turn green. She looks around, she says, "Daddy, why is this neighborhood pretty much all black?" Now that is a damn good question. She was 10, by the way, when she asked that question. Well, she's 10 and a half, because you know they like to give themselves that extra 6 months, basically, more secure. So the 10-year-old says, "Daddy, why is this neighborhood pretty much all black?" And I thought, wow, my 10-year-old is doing urban anthropology in the backseat of my Toyota. This is so good. You know, I'm so proud, and I was so ready with the answer, because honest to God, like sometimes when you're a parent, if you're a parent, you know what I'm saying, and even if you're not, you can figure this out. Like sometimes your kids will ask you shit you have no idea what they're talking about, and so then you feel helpless. But this is like the one question that my daughter could have asked that I know the answer to. Like if you say, "Where does electricity come from?" I would just be like, "Shh, Google it." I don't know. But you asked me about the racial dynamic of the neighborhood. Like, I actually know that, so I was ready. I had the answer right here. But here's what I learned. See, I didn't know this until that day, because I'm an only child. But apparently, when a younger sibling asks a question in front of the parent, in front of the older sibling will inevitably and without much delay attempt to answer the question their own damn self just to show off, right? So I didn't know this. Now I know this. So the 10-year-old says, "Why is this neighborhood pretty much all black?" And before I could even say anything, the 12-year-old was like, "Redlining," and I was like, "Holy shit, that's right." It's like, how do you know? Have you been reading my books? What? Do you just know stuff? Is it like genetic? Like you just know things? And I was like, what? And the 10-year-old was like, "Yeah, I don't know what redlining is." I'm like, "I don't think your sister does either, but that was a damn good guess." So now I had to start breaking it down. We only had 3 minutes left before we got to the studio. I knew that I couldn't do the PhD level version, but I could give them the thumbnail sketch of how the neighborhood came to be black, how it came to be poor, because that history is about a couple of things, right? It's about residential segregation, isolation, discrimination. It's also about the fact that the government, FHA loans, GI Bill, VA loans allowed white folks who used to live in that neighborhood to hustle it out to the suburbs on government money at a time when people of color couldn't, and that left folks of color trapped in that space, devoid of resources. So it wasn't just that it made it black, it also made sure that it remained low income. So I do the thumbnail sketch, I get to the studio, I drop them off, they seem to get the point. Right? And I drive away thinking, what happens if I don't know the answer to that question? What happens if the teachers in the schools never talk about it? And you know they don't, right? Because I didn't learn that in school, no, certainly not in high school. right? And I took AP history. That's the history for smart people, supposedly. That's the history that you take when you can handle all kinds of crazy, hard to handle shit. Like, you know, and they still didn't teach me that. So I had to learn that later. So what if I don't know the answer? My child grows up wondering, she's not gonna stop asking the question that she asked. She's gonna keep wondering, why is this neighborhood like it is? And why does it look different than that neighborhood over there? And this neighborhood over there. And if she doesn't have a sociological imagination, which we are not born with, we have to cultivate that by the narrative and the stories that we tell. If she doesn't get that answer, she will look around, she will decide what? That those people are living like that because there's something wrong with them. Because if there wasn't, they wouldn't live like that. And the people who live over there like that, who were living so much better, they must have done something right. They must just be smarter, because that's the default position of the culture. See, if we don't take aim at that, we can do all the work we want. We can have all the best intentions, right? But we will continue generation after generation to reinforce the rationalization and the justifications for inequality. We have to actually take aim at the most fundamental principle of American ideology. And that is not easy, right? That's like standing up in the third row of a church right after the Sunday sermon and announcing that God does not exist. It doesn't go over very well with the regulars, right? And the same is true here. The same is true here, but unless we're prepared to challenge it, we're in trouble. Because if I grow up thinking that wherever I end up is all about me, a couple things happen. If I become successful, I become a real asshole. Right? Because now I'm so smug about, oh, I'm just great, that's why I made all this money, that's why I've been successful. And if I don't make it, I start to internalize what? Self-doubt, self-hatred, right? And then I turn that against myself and other people like me. See, because poor people learn that lesson too, don't they? Poor folks learn the lesson that this is America. And even if you start at the bottom, you ought to be able to pull yourself up. And even though people at the bottom tend to know better, like, because people at the bottom understand the system a little better, and people of color certainly have a deeper understanding, I think, of the system historically than white folks, but it still affects you, right? There's no way that you can escape it, because advertising works, man. That's why companies spend billions of dollars to sell you stuff, because they know it works. There's research in the field of marketing which says if you see an advertisement 12 times, right, and you're exponentially more likely to buy the product after that 12th time. The first time you see the ad, if you're like me, you might not even know what the product was. You ever have that happen? You're like, the hell was that? How am I going to buy that? I don't even remember what the hell that was. That was stupid. Why did they waste all that money on an ad that I can't remember? Well, you're talking about it, aren't you? And then the next time you see it, you're going to pay a little more attention. By the 5th time, you're like, oh, Taco Bell Crunch Wrap. All right. And then by the 12th time, you're like, damn, I need to get one of those. So you're going out at 6 in the morning to get a damn breakfast Crunch Wrap from Taco Bell. You didn't want that. You never even thought of that. Nobody even dreamt up that stupid product until somebody was in a marketing meeting. They're like, watch this, right? So they come up with it, they blanket the ads, and all of a sudden you're like, hey, I gotta have a burrito wrapped around a taco with some sausage and egg in it at 6 a.m. I've been eating, Egg McMuffins forever, but I'm done with that. I hate that. I'm going with Taco Bell now. And now they make billions of dollars because they propagandize us to believe we need that, or we need this toothpaste, these tennis shoes, this smartphone, this tablet, this toilet paper, right? You see the ad enough, and so if you can be convinced to change toilet paper or toothpaste or tennis shoes or go to Taco Bell or whatever it is, right, for products that you don't necessarily need or want at that particular moment, or you go to the grocery and you do impulse purchases, you buy the candy at the front. Why do you think they put the candy at the front? You think that was like an accident? Like they just, like the guy that does the ordering was like, damn, I keep over-ordering candy. I don't know why. We got a whole candy aisle over there in aisle 7, but I'll be damned if I just can't ever order the right amount. I keep screwing it up, getting 20%. Where are we going to put this extra candy? Oh, I don't know. Let's put it up where they pay. Why not? Well, because they know that that'll work. People Magazine's up there because you're going to buy that beef jerky, whatever the hell, right, up there, because they know that's an impulse. If they can make you do that with like irrelevant consumables, right? How much easier do you think it is in a society for you to internalize those racist beliefs, those sexist beliefs, those classist beliefs, because you see that ad every day. Every single day it's drummed into us, and so naturally we start to internalize it, and then we see what happens in our politics. See, I would suggest that part of what hasn't been understood with the rise of Trumpism as a political phenomenon, but we better understand this, right? Because all these commentators that want to understand, why it is that white working class, struggling folks whose communities are dying in central PA or wherever else, right, are turning to Trump, right? Well, it's interesting. There's a lot we could say about that. I don't have nearly enough time to say it all, but let's think about this for a second. Why do you think there was a correlation, and there was, one of the single highest correlations between voting for Trump in those communities was that if the community had a particularly high level of opiate addiction? That was one of the single most highly correlated factors with support for Trump at the precinct level. Now, please don't misunderstand. I'm not saying you have to be high to vote for Trump. That's not actually my argument. That's not really my argument. It's a fascinating sociological inquiry, which, if you're an academic, you might want to, try to do that and write that study up, but that's not my argument. What I'm saying is, think about what an opiate is, right? What is it pharmacologically? It's only intended to do one thing, pharmacologically, block pain, right? It doesn't fix the problem. If you have a crushed disc, you're still going to have surgery. The opiate is not going to fix your disc, but it'll get you through. If you have cancer, the opiate's not going to get rid of the cancer, but it'll get you through until you get whatever else has to be done, chemo, radiation, surgery, or all three, right? So an opiate is something that blocks pain but doesn't solve the problem. So a politician comes along, and that politician says, I can take your pain. More than that, I can tell you who's to blame for it. And don't worry, it's not you, because see, here's the thing. Those working class white folks were raised to believe what? That wherever they end up is all about them. And that worked fine until the economy shifted under their feet. And the plant left, and the town started to die. And then they didn't know what to do with all that pain and that anxiety and insecurity. And the voice in the back of their head for years has told them what? It's your fault, man. Because if you were really worth anything, you wouldn't live like this. You'd be successful. So now they start to internalize that blame, and they need something to take the pain. It's either going to be an opiate they can get at the drugstore, or something they can get a script for, or it's going to be a walking, talking, breathing opiate like Donald Trump, who comes along and says, I can take your pain, and I can blame them for it. Because that's what we do, right? We see people of color in pain, and we don't think about the system. We just blame them.
That's right.
Right? That's what we did with the previous opiate crisis in the 70s with heroin. It's what we did with crack in the 80s and early 90s. Now all of a sudden we want all this sympathy, and we ought to, as we should have before. But the point is, understand the connection between opiate addiction and political racial scapegoating. Blaming people for problems that they didn't cause, because it allows you to do what? Escape your self-judgment. If we have a system that says wherever you end up is all about you, and you're a white, and especially if you're white, man, this is where it gets really deep, because at least people of color have a counter narrative, right? People of color, even though you've been propagandized by this mentality, there is a counter narrative that you've learned, whether it's at home or among friends or or just by paying attention, right? Folks of color can look around and realize it's never been as simple as work hard and you'll be fine. Right? No person of color, for instance, ever thought, as long as I'm willing to work hard, I'll have a job, right? And as long as I can lift things and have a strong back, I'm sure they'll employ me. Like, no person of color could ever take that for granted, but a lot of these white dudes could. That's what's deep, right? Even if you're white working class, you had the luxury of believing in horizontal mobility. You know what horizontal mobility is, right? Horizontal mobility is the kind that says, my granddaddy worked in the mine, my daddy worked in the mine, I'm working in the mine, I'm going to get my son a job at the mine, right? Or my granddaddy worked at the plant, my daddy worked at the plant, I'm working at the plant, and my son's got, they never seem to worry about their daughters, but they got jobs for their sons, right? And that may not be privilege in the elite economic sense, but there's a certain expectation in that. There's a certain sense of entitlement in that. As long as I'm willing to play by the rules, it will be okay. See, black and brown folks never had the luxury of believing that bullshit. And that's why they don't get knocked off stride the same way that some of these white folks did. Right? Because everybody says, well, it's economic anxiety made them vote for Trump. Hell, if economic anxiety in the abstract made you vote for Trump, black folks would have lined up around the block to vote for Trump, and they didn't. Latinx folks would have done the same. Asian Americans would have done the same. Indigenous people would have done the same. They didn't. It was white, working class, and struggling folks. And I would suggest it's because their expectationalism got ahead of the reality. Right? They were not supposed to suffer like this. When it was just those folks on the other side of town, oh, well, we expect that. But when it's us, we don't know where to put that pain. So you see, we have to understand that this meritocracy myth, this notion of rugged individualism, it isn't just dangerous for the usual suspects, the targets who have always been the targets, people of color, for instance. It's also dangerous for white folks. It actually comes back to bite white folks on the ass because it sets up a series of expectation and entitlement that can't always be fulfilled. Maybe historically it could be, but now the world has changed. And you know who's never ready for the world to change? The folks that never had to get ready for the world to change. The folks that were always getting displaced, like in New Orleans, you know, they had to understand they always had to have a hustle. They always had to have a plan. They always had to have a way to get that next move. Every person of color I've ever met, for instance, that works at a higher educational institution, like, you know, college or university, could be faculty, could be staff. I talk to folks all the time. I'm like, so are you gonna be here forever? It's like, what? They are always looking for the next thing, and they're putting out. They keep their resume updated daily, every day, updating their resume with the day and the hour of experience that they have. Looking at the Chronicle of Higher Education every damn week for whatever the next job is, and then the white academics I meet are like, they're ready to retire. They're good. They're like they're locked in forever. Because those folks of color know that the other shoe could drop tomorrow. See, and that actually makes you more flexible in the job market. It makes you more flexible in the society so you don't get knocked off stride when the economy craters, because that's just Monday, right? That's just every other week. It's the people that haven't had to do that who don't have to build up the coping skills and the perseverance skills that the marginalized do. And I don't mean to romanticize suffering by saying that. But it's something James Baldwin said many years ago that made the point as well as I could, no doubt more. This is what Baldwin said. He said, I don't mean to be sentimental about suffering, but the person who can never suffer can never grow up. And he went on to say that when a man is forced every day to snatch his humanity out of the fires of human cruelty that rage to destroy it, he learns something about himself in the process that no school and no church on earth can teach, and that's a sense of his own authority. And that is unshakable, because in order to survive, he has to learn how to understand the words behind the words, the meaning behind the words, to be able to read between the lines. And he closes by saying, when you're constantly having to survive the worst that life can bring, you cease to be afraid of the worst that life can bring. So that's what people of color have to teach white folks. That's the thing about whiteness. It's actually led us down a path, those of us who are white, that we don't even understand the basic realities of life in this country the way folks of color do. We should have listened a little better, quite a bit better, because that myth of meritocracy is now coming back to harm all of us. And finally, there are a couple other things, right? The language that we use when we describe a phenomenon will overdetermine the way we respond to that phenomenon. So the thing that drives me crazy in human service organizations and among good people, and we've all done this, I find myself falling into it from time to time. We use this language sometimes that undermines our ability to see the system. So we use phrases like at risk to talk about folks. Now, I know some people are at risk, but now that's an awfully passive way to say it, isn't it? Because what are they at risk from? See, if we don't name it, then we can't address it. If I just say somebody's at risk, like at risk from some generic shit that I don't even want to tell you what it is, right? Then how am I going to construct policy and procedure and program to actually get at that? They're at risk from what? Don't want to talk about it. Whereas if I say they're at risk from institutional racism, they're at risk from institutional economic injustice, they're at risk from rape culture, they're at risk from heterosexism, they're at risk from da-da-da-da-da-da. See, now I'm naming things. And there's power in that language, right? It's not a passive thing, right? Nobody is a passive victim of anything. A passive target of anything. Same thing when we use phrases like, and we've all used them at some point, we use terms like underprivileged. The hell is underprivileged? What is that? I mean, that's what my third grade teacher would call the passive voice, right? Because it doesn't imply that anybody did anything to anyone. It's just there's privilege and I'll be damned, there's you. How the hell did you get down there? Don't know, don't want to know, don't ask, right? And the other problem is, that word by definition is a relative word. That's just basic rules of grammar. That's not politics or ideology. That's not me saying that. That's Roget's thesaurus saying that, right? Underprivileged by definition is relative to what? Privilege. No, not privilege. Overprivilege. That's what it's actually relative to and opposite of. Privilege is too generic. Overprivilege is the opposite of underprivileged, but that word doesn't even exist. Right? Look it up. It's not in the dictionary. Overprivilege is not a thing. We're just talking about the underprivileged and the privileged. Now, if someone is under, someone else is over, again, that's basic grammar. Why don't we call it what it is? Because we don't want to deal with honest language. See, because then if somebody has too much of something, we might actually have to start talking about redistribution, and then that makes us nervous and we get all dicey about it. We use words like underserved. What the hell kind of language is that? Here's service, and I don't know, here's you. Right? If you got underserved, somebody got overserved. Right? It's not like that service just like sits in the backyard in a big hole. If nobody's using it, somebody's going to pick it up, right? The same thing with privilege. Somebody got too little, the excess is not just sitting there in the garage. Like, it's going to get used by somebody, right? So we have to use honest language, and we have to make sure we're not bullshitting with the people we serve. Because the people that you serve in an institution like this, all those folks that you're trying to reach and make a difference in their life, they know the deal better than sometimes we do. Right? They know their lives. We don't trust them to tell us about their lives, right? Because we're experts, you know. We have all the credentials. We went to school and learned all this shit, right? But they oftentimes know a lot more about it than we do. I learned more doing public housing community organizing from the people who lived there than I learned in sociology classes from people with PhDs, right? And so part of this is about not bullshitting folks about what is going on in their lives and actually letting them know that you see what they see. Very important. Very important. Several years ago I was doing a talk in Minneapolis. And it was a conference being called by this organization that had a bunch of charter schools. And I'm very cynical about charters, but these particular folks seemed pretty serious about addressing institutional inequity. And I thought, well, if they want to have me, I'm going to go. So I go, and I'm there for the whole day. I'm watching the other speakers talk to these young people. A third of these kids are unhoused. Right? They're all poor, disproportionately of color. And these people are getting up talking at them. Not to them or with them, at them. And doing the typical thing that we do, that older folks do to younger folks. That typical ageist bullshit where it's just like, pull your pants up, get your shit together. Stop listening to those headphones so loud. Turn that music down. Just some boot camp shit. And these kids are checked out, as you can imagine, right? These young men and women are just, they're slack back in the chair. They got the headphones on precisely because you told them to take them off, right? They're not paying any attention. They're rolling their eyes. They're you know, doodling, whatever the hell they're doing, right? And I'm the last speaker of the day. And I was like, God, what in the hell is this 43-year-old white man from Nashville, Tennessee, gonna say to these young folk, mostly of color, that is gonna break the crap they've been hearing all day? So I got up, and the first thing I did was, I said, I just wanna apologize. I said, I wanna apologize on behalf of this whole country. I said, they did not authorize me, by the way, to apologize. But I'm going to do it anyway because we lied to you. And they all sort of looked up, and I said, yeah, we've all lied to you. And I sort of suspect you know it, but let me just be clear. We lied to you when we said that you could be anything you wanted to be in this country if you just worked hard. That was bullshit. We didn't mean it. And I suspect you know that we lied. And now all of a sudden, some very interesting dynamics are in the room. The adults are starting to get nervous. Because they know that I have 30 more minutes of this. And when you start where I just started, it's not going to get any easier. Right? The young people are like, all of a sudden looking around, sitting up straight in the chair. They take the headphones off. This one guy looks at his buddy next to him, and he didn't say it out loud because he was too polite, but I could read his lips. He's like, what is this shit? Right? And his buddy's like, I don't know, but I'm taking notes. And he takes out some paper. And so all I did was I laid out the contours of this lie that we told them and all the things that we've done to make sure that we don't actually fulfill the promises that we made. And here's the thing. I didn't tell them anything they didn't know. Right? It's not that I'm the brilliant white man who stands up and dispenses truth to these young folks disproportionately of color. All I did was ratify what they already knew in their heart and in their mind to be true, but which they had never had a member of an authority group, particularly a white male in authority, actually look at them and confirm. You know how important it is to have folks ratify your reality? It shouldn't be necessary. It ought to be enough that you live it and you experience it and you are rational and you know about what you're speaking. But in a society that actually encourages people of color and poor folks to think they are the problem, right? We talk about mental illness, we don't talk about the way that the society is geared to crazy making. The institutions of the society are set up to drive you insane, right? Just try making phone calls. You could have private health insurance. Good luck calling all the people you got to call to try to figure out what's going to be covered and what's not going to be covered by your plan. You spend 4 hours on the phone, they transfer you 7 times. You could be the most mentally and emotionally healthy person when you started that call on the planet. And by the time you're done, you will have been driven up a wall and will be suffering all kinds of anxiety, right? Let alone if you already had anxiety going in. So the society is set up to make folks think they're crazy, right? And oftentimes to manifest those kinds of self-doubt and self-hatred beliefs that can render you quote-unquote crazy. So we have to ratify people's truth. And by the time the talk was over, and I looked at them and said, yeah, this is all bullshit. And if you want it not to be, it's on you and on us to recreate this system just by ratifying that truth. There was another story around that time that I told those young people. There was a teacher out in outside of Denver, Cherry Creek, Colorado, white guy teaching a class, 9th grade, I think it was. And it was, he noticed that the black kids in the class, particularly the black males, weren't doing very well. He knew they were bright because he had talked to them in the hall. He knew they were intelligent, but they just weren't putting forth the effort. But he wasn't going to give up on them the way some folks would. And he decided he was going to try something different. So he came in one day, he goes up to the whiteboard behind, or the chalkboard, whichever one it was, and he starts writing all these statistics and data and charts and graphs and tables, right? And the students are getting antsy now because they're like, what the hell is that? Is that going to be on the test? Like, we've never seen that. He didn't answer anything. They kept asking him, what is it? He wouldn't say anything. 15 minutes go by, he's filled up the whole board. And he turns around, they say, what is it? He says, that right there is evidence somebody's trying to kill you. And they said, what are you talking about? Somebody's trying to kill us. And he goes over and he says what the data was. He says, this right here is the data on incarceration rates in the greater Denver area between white folks, black folks, and brown folks. These right here are the wealth and net worth data. This is the unemployment data. This is racial profiling data. This is infant mortality data, da-da-da-da-da-da. Right? So he's doing the algebra of oppression. And he's explaining, now, this is why numbers are important. This is why math is important. This is why data is important. We can either blow up these statistics or you can become one because there are lots of folks out there ready for you to be one. What's it going to be? Right? And again, he wasn't telling these young black men anything they didn't know. They knew that stuff was happening. They might not have had the data in their heads because nobody had given them that, but they knew effectively at their own life experience that it was real, but never had an authority figure look them dead in the eye and said, yeah, you know that thing you think is happening? Yeah, that shit is happening. So now what are we going to do? In fact, if anything, they'd had authority figures tell them to get it together, work harder, you can be anything, stay in school, blah, blah, blah. Everything will be great if you just apply yourself. And here was a guy that said, yeah, that's not going to be enough. You're going to have to work hard and we're going to have to change this system. And so what do you think happened? These young black men who have been getting D's and F's started getting A's and B's, right? Because now they understood the social value of the math class. It wasn't just something that they were being asked to do so they could pass a state exam. Right? It was something they were being asked to do to save their lives. Right? So they start getting A's and B's. They set up a mentoring program for middle school black kids. Right? They call it the Brotherhood. That scared the shit out of people at the Cherry Creek schools. They're like, the Brotherhood? What the hell is that, a gang? Like, it's a math gang. It's scary. They start working with the young folks, right? And then of course the school board calls him in front of the school board and says, you can't tell these kids somebody's trying to kill them. And he says, well, why the hell not? It's true. He's like, but you can't tell them that, right? He said, we have other ways to reach them. He's like, for real? Because I've been teaching for 15 years and I haven't found one yet. This one seems to work. Right? So what was really going on? They just didn't want to tell the truth. This guy wanted to tell and ratifying that reality is an incredibly empowering thing. Social workers have to do that. Therapists have to do that. Counselors need to do that. Doctors need to do that. Anybody who's working with people in crisis, it's critical to not only let them speak and hear what they have to say about their crisis, but to contextualize that crisis. It's not an individual crisis, it's systemic. I know some of y'all are familiar with the research on epigenetic and epigenetic memory, but for those who aren't, right? It's this fascinating new research, not really completely new, but relatively so, right? It looks at the way trauma is transmitted intergenerationally. When they started this research, right, they started it with rats in the lab. They took these rats, and they started, mice actually, and they were trying to see if they could sort of like a Pavlovian experiment where they would subject the mice to a shock, a very mild electrical shock in their feet. And they were going to do it after introducing the smell of lavender into the cage. So all of a sudden they would pipe in lavender and then they would shock the mouse. And the idea was the more you do that, they'll learn, right? They'll learn that when they smell the lavender, the shock is coming and they'll jump even when you don't shock them. And naturally that's what happened. So they kept doing it, and after a while, the mice who were subjected to the shock were responding even when the shock didn't happen, just when they smelled the lavender, because their brains were saying, hey, it's coming, you know? So they started jumping. That's not surprising that the actual mouse subjected to the shock would respond that way. But then what they noticed was 2 generations later of mice, right? The grand mice of the original mice. They started pumping in lavender to the cage, and those mice started to jump, and they had never been shocked. Right? Intergenerational transmission of trauma, causing certain genes to express differently. The epigenetic theory is not that it changes your DNA, right? But it causes certain proteins to express certain things in the DNA to express that maybe otherwise would not. They've now started doing this research on survivors of the European Holocaust, of European Jewry, and they have found that children and grandchildren even of camp survivors are manifesting certain physiological traits of trauma, and they were not in the camp, and even if they were never told the stories by their grandparents, in other words, they haven't had any actual story told about what their family experienced, but they're manifesting excess cortisol release, right, that can't be explained through other means. And so we're actually seeing intergenerational trauma, and this is an idea that indigenous people have known for a long time. It's this concept of the soul wound, this idea that colonialism and conquest created this intergenerational trauma. And for years, of course, white medicine, Western medicine said, well, that's all nonsense. And it doesn't come as a shock to black folks who understand the intergenerational trauma, beginning from the Middle Passage all the way to the present. But for Western science, no, you can't quantify that. But then we start doing it with mice, and then we start doing it with some white folks out of Europe, European descended white folks who were Jewish, and now we believe it. Right? So maybe we need to start thinking about what this means when we're dealing with folks in crisis. They're carrying 2 and 3, 4 generations of crisis, not personal flaw, not personal deficit, but a systemic deficit, which we have to be clear about, and we have to use clear language about. And finally, what we must do if we're going to uproot the racism that exists in the modern era is we just have to start with some radical humility, both about ourselves and about our ability to discern truth from fiction, our lens. Humility about ourselves in the sense that we need to start telling a different narrative about how we got where we are, because if we're going to break down that myth of rugged individualism and meritocracy, we got to question it about ourselves. Because there's an incentive that every one of us has, if we become even remotely successful, to hold on to that like that's about us. Right? And then if we do that, we will end up indirectly looking down on people that haven't quote unquote made it. Whereas if we're honest, we've all had help. And some of our help was connected to our race, some of it was connected to our gender, some of it was connected to economics, some of it was just luck, right? That mentor that you had when you were 11, or that teacher that believed in you in 3rd grade when the rest of the teachers didn't. We've all had help. No one has made it on there, and there's no such thing as an individual. Human beings are a social species. We never lived on an island raised by a porpoise. Right? Hell, if you ever actually do meet a thing that could qualify as a rugged individual, you need to get the hell away from that. Because they're going to be dangerous, man. They're not going to have language. They're not going to know that thing about not eating you because nobody would have told them, right? You need to get the hell away from anything that really qualifies as an individual, let alone a rugged one, because they are going to be feral, right? You don't want anything to do with that. We're not individuals. We live in social contexts. So we got to be honest. The only reason I'm here, so I don't ever ask people to do an exercise like that I'm not willing to do, so I'll just break it down for you right here. Why am I here? I'm here because I've been doing this work for 27 years. I started, like I said, doing the work against David Duke. The only reason I got that job was I knew the 2 guys that started the organization. One was a history professor, one was a grad student, and a friend of mine. If I don't go to Tulane University and meet those men, they don't offer me that job. I don't get to fight David Duke. I don't build up a national reputation as an anti-racism educator and activist, and I'm not here today. But the only reason I was at Tulane was because I was chasing a girl that went to Louisiana State. God's honest truth. I met her at a summer debate institute for high school debaters at American University in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1985, and she said, oh no, you can't go to Emory in Atlanta, which is where I was planning on going. I'd never even thought of Tulane, and that wasn't even on my radar, but she said, no, you can't go to college in Atlanta after this year. You've got to go to Tulane, so we'll be close to one another. And I, in the manner of a damn 16-year-old in love, said, of course, that's what I mean. So I go to Tulane because of her. If I don't meet her, she doesn't convince me to go to Tulane. I don't meet those men, get that job, fight David Duke, build up that reputation, and none of this other stuff happens for me. But the only reason I was able to meet her was I was a high school debater, and the only reason I was a high school debater, that was a fluke also, right? Because even though I like to run my mouth, right, that was not my actual original plan. I had planned on playing baseball. I was a jock as a kid, was a really good baseball player, not like Donald Trump good, because I know you've heard Donald Trump insist he was the best baseball player in the city of New York in 1962. Now keep in mind, for those who were baseball fans, the Yankees won the series in 1962, but Donald J. Trump was better than Mickey Mantle, he was better than Roger Maris, he was better than Whitey Ford, he was better than Elston Howard, he was better than all of those guys. So I wasn't Donald Trump good, but I was all right for a little white boy from Nashville, Tennessee. And I had college scouts that would come to my games when I was like 11 and 12, so I thought that was going to be my path. But then I got to high school and tried out for the team and had an inexplicably horrible high school try. It's like I'd never thrown the ball, couldn't field the ball, couldn't hit anything, got cut. Right? Which means if I don't get cut from that team, I'm not going to be a debater. I only became a debater because I had to have a new activity when I didn't make the baseball team. If I make the team, I'm not going to be at a debate camp over the summer. I'll be playing ball in the summer. So at the end of the day, the only reason that I'm here is because of that asshole that cut me from the baseball team. To whom I owe everything. Coach Cantrell, thank you, right? But that's my point. That's just some random stuff that actually and it doesn't take away from whatever skills I have to admit that. It doesn't take away from my ability as a speaker, as an educator, as a writer, but it's about having the radical humility to admit that you've had help. And the minute we all start doing that, the harder it is to maintain this society that's rooted on judgmentalism about the people below you and undue praise for the people above you. See, if we start telling different stories, we can get different realities. The stories we tell make the determination of the kind of society we're going to have. Because the narrative holds in place all of these systems. But also, I mean being radically honest and humble about our lens and how oftentimes it's distorted, right? The reality is, historically, white Americans, we have never seen the problem for what it is at the time. At the time. It's one thing to look back 50 years or 100 years, and I've done this in workshops where I'll ask white folks who are all across the political spectrum. They're not all people who are progressive or liberal, lots very conservative. I'll ask them, do you think that folks of color had equal opportunity in the early 60s, in the 50s, in the 30s, the 1890s? And of course, every single one of them is willing to say, well, of course not. Every single one of them, no matter their current politics, is willing to say, well, no, my God, it was terrible back then, right? Even though they don't think that it's terrible today, even though they don't think it's a problem now, they're willing to acknowledge that it once was. But here's the problem. Back in the day when the early 60s were actually happening, not a half a century in the rearview mirror, but at the time, the Gallup organization went out and asked white Americans, do you think that black folks are treated equally in housing, employment, and education? And at that time, in 1963, 2 out of 3 white folks said, yeah, everything's fine. In 1962, 85 out of 100 white folks told Gallup poll that black children had the same chance to get a good education as white children. 85 out of 100 believed that, even in 62, that's before the Civil Rights Act, before the Voting Rights Act, before the Fair Housing Act. So what does that tell us? Because most of those folks were reasonably decent, kind, functional people. I believe most people are good folks. I believe most people don't wake up wanting to hurt other human beings today, right? But the reality is they didn't know because they didn't have to know. They had the privilege of being oblivious. They didn't have to know the reality in which people of color lived, and as a result of not having to know it, they didn't know it. And there's no shame in that, but you got to be humble enough to own that and acknowledge that. That when you have a blind spot, when you're oblivious, you got to own up to it. Like, I'm oblivious to calculus, y'all. You know why? Because I didn't take it. You know why I didn't take it? Because they didn't make me. And if they weren't going to make me, I sure as hell was not going to volunteer for the punishment. Right? No offense to folks who like calculus, somebody's got to do that shit. I just knew it wasn't going to be me. So I never took it. As a result, if I were to stand up here and try to do calculus, y'all would all be like, he does not know what he's talking about. And he just told us he never took the class. Exactly. But in this country, white folks sometimes act like we know when racism is happening better than people of color, and we never took the class. You got me? And men act like we know when sexism and misogyny and rape culture are happening better than the women who are the targets of it, and we never took the class. Straight and cisgendered folk act like we understand transphobia and straight supremacy better than the ones who are the target, and we didn't take the class. People who are rich think they understand the culture of poverty and poor people better than folks who are actually experiencing economic marginality in the moment. So part of radical humility is letting go of the conceit that says that you're actually more of an expert than the ones who are, by virtue of their daily life, expert in these things. And it's about recognizing that sometimes the greatest wisdom resides with the person being served, not the one providing the service. Thank you all so much. So we have about 28 minutes left before we're done. I'll be happy to take questions. I also, by the way, I'm really bad at the commerce piece because I'm real self-conscious about it. I'm just like, I got books. You want to buy them? Okay. Or not. Who cares? Whatever. I have them. They are my latest book, which came out a year and a half ago, called Under the Affluence: Shaming the Poor, Praising the Rich, and Sacrificing the Future of America. It talks a lot about the stuff I was talking about here in the speech. So if you want to get a copy, they're $17. It's I can take cards with a swiper and all that. Or again, don't worry if you don't want to. Like I said, I'm not a good salesperson. I just my kids have a college fund and that's it. So don't feel guilty or obligated. But I'd love to sell you the books. I got about 18 copies. So if you have, and I'll sign them and all that. Yeah, all that good stuff. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them, and we'll do that for 20 minutes roughly, and then I'll let you get out of here and get back to work. Yeah.
Okay, so of course we all love hearing you because we're here,
Right.
and I'll buy a book, put one aside for me. How do you get the word out to all these people that voted for Trump and the rest of the? I mean, what do you do? What do we do?
Well, I think a lot of this is as simple and as complicated as the old, each one teach one maxim that the movement has so long relied upon. This idea that we create these concentric circles of wisdom and understanding by the people that we touch. So sure, I might be in a room where the overwhelming majority, maybe every single person in the room, is generally on board, although I find that is actually never true. But theoretically it could be true. And yet we all have concentric circles beyond this room that we can begin to touch. And part of why, the way that I conceive of my work is not so much converting people as it is providing a language and a framework that people can use to go out and, for lack of it's a weird thing for a Jew to say, evangelize, right? Because it's not really our thing. Like, we just don't do that. Go out and talk to people who maybe are in a different place. And I think part of the way we do it, just like what I was recommending in here about being able to listen to the people that are being served by this organization and its various subunits. It's also important to be able to listen to folks who are in a very different space ideologically. Now, I want to put an asterisk at the end of what I just said, because I don't think it is the job of people of color to suffer white foolishness for one more minute. So I don't think it's black and brown folks' job to go out and reach out with love and compassion to the white working class who have ignored black and brown pain for generations. I don't think it's black and brown folks' job to show compassion about the opioid crisis to people who don't show compassion about the crises in communities of color. I think reciprocity is called for, and it is a prerequisite in my estimation. But I do think for those of us who are white, those are our people, and we got to come get them. right? So in Louisiana, when David Duke got those 625,000 votes from white people, it's not black folks' job to save white people from David Duke. Thankfully they did, because if it had been up to us, we'd have voted him in. 60% were willing to do so. And black folks, except for those two guys I mentioned, right? They were like, no, we're gonna stop y'all. You can't have the Nazi, we're sorry. And thank God they did that. But ultimately what I came to realize was that was my job. I had to come from my people, just like I would want them to come from me. And so if a person of color does have the level of compassion to extend that, that's a gift, but it's not owed. It's not owed. It's a gift, but it's not owed. And so I want us, those of us who are white, to take that on. Those of us who are men to take on a part of that task. Women cannot alone lift the weight of fighting back misogyny and rape culture. Men are going to have to do our part challenging other men, etc., on down the line. And the thing is, every single one of us in here has got a piece of that to own. Because every single one of us in here, I guarantee, is a member of at least one dominant group. Maybe not racially dominant or gender dominant or class dominant, but if you're able-bodied, you have dominant status over people with disabilities. If you're college educated, over people that don't have a college degree. If you have your hearing, you have privilege over people who are deaf who experience autism, which is a word we don't even know in this culture, but that's the word for the systemic injustice aimed at people in the deaf community. So every one of us in here, if you're straight or cisgendered, you got privilege and advantage relative to folks in the LGBTQ community. So a good friend of mine who I've worked with over the years, occasional colleague, Jackie Wade, social work professor from Middle Tennessee State, has a way of saying it in trainings that we've done. She says, and she's this African-American woman, she says, you know, we all have a couple nickels in the quarter. And now some of us might have a couple dimes in the quarter, but everybody's got a couple of nickels in the quarter, and we have to own our nickels, right? And that means owning the place where we're oblivious and challenging other people. And the way you do it is not with judgmental, didactic instruction. It's about asking questions. It's about asking people why they think what they think and why they see what they see. And what does it mean that they see this and you see this? Because that's an interesting question to ask. Why is it, for instance, that even when, and this is how I start a lot of my workshops with hard to reach people, is I'll go back to that thing I said about the Gallup polls and I'll say, you know, tell me, why do you think it is that even when racism was obvious, because I've just gotten them to admit, you know, even the biggest Trump supporter will generally acknowledge, yeah, it was horrible a long time ago. Oh my God, I'm glad it's not like that anymore. That would be their argument, right? But if we can all acknowledge how horrible it was, and yet I can show you that when it was horrible, white folks didn't think it was horrible. Why is that? Tell me why white folks couldn't see it even when it was blatant. And that person who's hard to reach will usually give me a couple of different answers. So they might say, well, isolation, right? Those white folks weren't really around very many black people, so they didn't know. Or they might say, they didn't have to know, you know, it wasn't required knowledge, and you know, and all the things they say are still true. 88% of white folks today live in communities with virtually no people of color around, in the direct, immediate neighborhood. So that level of isolation is still there. Our kids still, by and large, go to racially identifiable schools. We still don't have to know the truth. It's not like it's on the test, right? That shit's not on the SAT, right? Like, hey, white folks, in order to go to college, you need to prove that you know what black people experience. Yeah, that's not on there. If it was on there, we'd be clear. We'd learn it real quick. But they don't put it on there. So I can get that person who's telling me there's not really a problem to see that in a way, they're carrying on the very same tradition of other folks generations back who didn't see it even when it was obvious. And if you didn't see it when it was obvious, how much easier is it to miss it when maybe it's not as obvious? Maybe it's a bit more subtle. So there's a way to, it's like a thought experiment, walking through a bunch of questions rather than judging someone harshly. It's also about empathy. Like that stuff I did in that talk today about the opiate nature of Trumpism. That is inherently an empathic argument. I'm suggesting that white folks are hurting precisely because and to the extent we have remained blind to the way the world actually works. In other words, I'm saying white people are hurting because of whiteness. White people are hurting because whiteness has allowed us to believe the system was set up and was fair, and that if we just worked hard, we can make it. That's not just Like, the notion of meritocracy is very specific to the larger edifice of how white supremacy works. So I think in a way what I'm saying is, white folks, yes, you're in pain. And yes, that pain is real. And yes, that pain deserves to be addressed. But the irony is, you're in pain precisely because black and brown folks are in pain. And because you were told that their pain was justified and we didn't have to do anything about it, now it's come back to bite you on the ass. Because if we deal with the crack epidemic, and we deal with the heroin epidemic with treatment and education rather than mass incarceration, then we don't have this problem that we have right now, right? So I think if we listen and we acknowledge the pain, but we redirect the source of that. It's like, if you tell me that you have a pain in your side, I'll be sympathetic, right? But I'm not going to indulge your bad diagnosis, right? So if you got on Google this morning and typed in pain in my side, what is it? And then some idiot on a chat room was like, oh, it's cancer, you're going to die by the end of the week. And you believed it. I don't have to indulge the ridiculousness here, right? Now, and I say this as somebody who consults Dr. Google way too damn much, right? Like, I have something wrong with my neck, I'm like, oh my God, I've slipped a disc, and oh my God, I've got something wrong with me, and I picked up luggage wrong. That's all I did. But I do that, but I want somebody to be sympathetic. Like when I wrenched my back, and I wanted my wife to have empathy, but she wasn't going to play around with my bullshit. She was like, you are not dying, but I went to the hospital. I'm like, oh God, I think I'm going to have a heart attack. $6,000 later, she was like, see what I told you? And you spent $6,000 because you're an idiot. And I realized in that moment she was empathic about the pain, but she was not empathic about my ridiculousness in interpreting it. So we can do both of these things. And I think if we're willing to talk with folks and challenge them, but challenge them in a way that acknowledges that they're hurting. Millions of people are hurting. They just don't really have anyone who's ever given them a sense of the source of that and the way that that's connected to black and brown suffering. It's not happening in spite of it, it's happening because of it. Next question, please. Yeah.
How do you talk to someone that doesn't or isn't willing to listen? They think, oh, okay, you're in a lower class and your education is further than mine, so what really can you show me?
Well, I think obviously when someone demonstrates that they're not willing to listen, either because they walk away from the conversation or they blow up at you, basic common sense says walk away. You cannot reach everyone. But here's the good news. You don't have to. And I think sometimes those of us who consider ourselves to be progressive or whatever term we want to use, place way too much faith in the power of reason, right? We just sort of figure like if we lay out all the facts, surely you'll come around, right? Because that's how like the liberal mindset just operates on this assumption like everything's about rationality. That's not what humans are. Human beings are fundamentally irrational. We do irrational shit all the time. All the time. So the idea that you just show me some data, well, my God, my entire worldview has been wrong my whole life. Nobody does that. In fact, the research says most of the time, if somebody's really dug in on a position and you just give them a bunch of facts to prove that they're wrong, they dig in harder. Right? So if somebody really wants to believe that climate change isn't real and you show them reams of data, they're actually going to dig in more. Now that sounds hopeless because then you go, my God, what works then if facts don't work? Well, there is some research on that. And what tends to work is stories, narrative, right? Personal stories. So I remember when I was doing organizing in public housing, when I would talk to people, I remember going on a radio program right around the time the welfare reform bill was being debated in '96. And those of us doing that work were horribly opposed to that bill because we knew that when the economy went sour, it was going to throw a lot of people into distress. And it did. We were right about that. We tried to warn folks, but Bill Clinton signed the legislation anyway, and it became law. And I was on a radio show trying to explain why it was a bad bill about a week before it was signed, or a week before it passed, actually, before it passed the Congress. And I went into the radio program and I had all my note cards, right? All my note cards lined up on the board and on the desk. I was ready. So if any caller called in with some bullshit about this, that, or the other, I was ready. I had that card right there. I'm going to read you this statistic. And then, bam, I got you. And then somebody else calls and says some other crap. And then I got another piece of data. You're wrong again. And I did that for like an hour. I kept it up. I was working up a sweat. The host was like, damn, you're really good at this. And I'm like, oh, it's good. I got it. You know, going off on these callers, thinking that I'm convincing them. Because I come out of that debate background where I put all that emphasis on facts and winning arguments. And then this guy calls and blew it up for me completely, right? He calls and he's like, well, I just have one thing to say. As the old saying goes, liars always figure, and figures always lie. And then he hangs the phone up, and I was like, I got nothing. Right? Because what that demonstrated to me was facts weren't going to matter to somebody who was really, for whatever reason, psychologically, materially, politically, ideologically, devoted to that narrative. So the next time I came back, I didn't bring any of that stuff. Instead, I got up and I told stories about the folks I was working with every day. And I had asked permission to do so. I didn't name them, but I told their stories. And I talked about how their daily lives were the best evidence that the stereotypes about poor folks and folks on public assistance were wrong. Now, I can prove it to you with data, but I'm just going to prove it to you with stories. And so I told the story about one of the women that worked with us, who was the office manager at the time for the organization I worked with. She was a resident of public housing, had been for quite a while. Kept the office running. Without her, the office doesn't operate. One Friday, I think it was the end of the week, Thursday or Friday, we hear that her son had died in a drive-by shooting. 1995, this was, and no, 96, early 96. And he was one of 300 young black men that year who were killed in the city of New Orleans, and there were another 80 black women, I think, and some white folks as well. New Orleans was the murder capital in 94, 95 of the country, 96. And so her son gets killed, and the next day, she's at work. So Monday comes, she buries her child, I guess, over the weekend, and Monday comes, she's there. And we're all sort of taken aback by that. We thought she would take some time. You know, we didn't expect her to be at work. And everybody sort of looked at her and said, you know, you don't need to be here. You just buried your son. Take some time off, you know, paid leave, whatever. And she's like, no, I have a job to do, and I'm here to do it. Right? And it made me realize, like, here I was 25, 26 years old. There were times I called out of work just because I was too tired to come in. Because I'd been out late, partying with friends, because it's New Orleans and that's what you do. I just didn't want to come in that day. I had something else I had to do. And here's a woman that just buried her son, who we are told in this culture has a bad work ethic, and that's why she lives in public housing. And I'm told that people like me have a good work ethic. That's why we graduated from Tulane. And she's putting me and everybody else in that office to shame by being there on Monday when we'll call out over some bullshit. Right? So I tell that story on the radio. Or I tell the story of some of the other folks that I'm meeting, and that has a very different effect, because now, even though it's just anecdote, and as the old saying goes, anecdote doesn't prove a point, it simply illustrates a point. But interestingly, when it comes to issues like this, the illustration is more valuable than the data, right? Because it humanizes the people that we work with, right? So telling their stories even better, letting them tell their stories and providing opportunities for them to do so is really even better. But at the very least, right, manifesting that approach at least has a better shot of working. And it doesn't always work, but that's okay. We don't need everybody. That's the other thing that progressive people put too much faith in is we gotta have a majority. No, we don't. No movement for justice ever in the history of the world has had even remotely a majority. It's always been a very small group of folks that worked harder at justice than the other folks worked at injustice. And trust me when I tell you, we don't need 50% plus one. I don't know what we need. It's more than we got now. Less than 50% plus one and more than we got now. And in between there is a lot of room, right? I mean, the fact is, back in the 80s, the head of the Christian Coalition, right-wing evangelical group, Ralph Reed, director at that time, said famously, we don't need 50%. All we need is about 8, 9, 10% of America behind us, because everybody else will be at home watching TV. I think he specifically said Falcon Crest, which is a little bit dated for some folks in the room, but that was a big show in the 80s. Now it would be like Bachelorette or American Idol, or not, you know, maybe not Idol, but America's Got Talent or whatever, right? Or So You Think You Can Dance or whatever the hell. But the idea was most people are just checked out. All we need is 8%. If we get 8%, he was saying, we can run this. and understand we might need more than 8, but we don't need 50. We just need some folks that are truly committed to pushing a counter narrative and pushing new and different institutional realities. And we're going to lose some folks, but I think we're also going to bring some folks in. And mobilization is just as important as conversion, right? Because converting the heathen is nice, but if your church is mobilized, again, I'm using all these church references, which is just like weird for me as a Jew, but whatever. Like, I'm just in that space mentally. If our church is mobilized, if our body of worship is mobilized, it doesn't matter that some other folks are stealing sheep left and right, for their service. We're going to do our thing. And whether or not we convert the heathen, so to speak, doesn't matter, because we're mobilized and better than the other folks. Other questions? Yes?
Full disclosure, I don't work for RHD, so I'm allowed to say good reply. So I work with and for a lot of liberal white people who think they're in this fight in support of a liberal agenda that supports people and communities of color. But time and time again, I see a lot of their decisions aren't really in support of the community which we endeavor to serve.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask the question more specifically about how to really help liberal white people who think they're on the fight of justice and ignoring the blind spots that they currently operate in.
Right.
But I think you kind of answered that with respect to maybe the personal stories as a way to convert them. But I think it's somewhat of a problem when people who think they have been converted, but they're not truly converted in a way that I might see. To how to galvanize them to rally and support these communities, which again, we endeavor to serve. That's my first question.
Right.
The other question I have is also, do you think you have more opportunity to speak about race relations in America because you are a white man, right? A lot of things of what you're saying to the point of ratifying the pain which we see as people of color, right? If you were a black woman saying this, a lot of people would be like, oh, that's a great unique experience. Right, but it's really powerful that a white man is saying it to check that box. It's super powerful. So I wonder if you think you have an extra lever, an extra opportunity because of people.
Of course. I'll take that one first, and then the first one second. Of course, that's true. Being white, being male, being straight, cisgendered, able-bodied, college-educated, all of those things have absolutely conspired and combined to elevate and to amplify my voice more than would have been the case, certainly as quickly as was the case. It didn't happen overnight, but it certainly happened faster than it has happened for the vast majority of people of color who raise their voice and write and speak. Now the good news is that the vast majority of people who are speakers, writers, lecturers, teachers, educators on these issues are still people of color, as well it should be. And if it's ever not that, we got a real problem. But there's no doubt that for those of us who are white, and especially if we're male, and especially if we're straight, and all of those things, our voice carries. Just like when men stand up as men and challenge sexism, we get a lot more kudos for that, unnecessarily and unjustly, frankly, than women do when they say the same thing. Now, of course, the dilemma, once one says yes to the question you asked, right, the dilemma is, what does one do with that truth? Because the only options are you try to use that elevated, amplified voice to make a difference and to create something that's different than what we have now, or you unjustly bank it and take advantage of it in some other realm of life. And sometimes the two things overlap. I realize that there's an inherent contradiction and an inherent dilemma for any white person doing this work. And that's why it's important for us to amplify the voices of people of color. It's why in our social media streams and in our books, I always try to make sure to steer people to the work of people of color, the folks of color who have been my mentors, whether that, the folks at the People's Institute who I mentioned, whether it's folks like Donna who I worked with at Agenda for Children, whether it's writers like James Baldwin, without whose literary inspiration I would understand far less about race, whether it's the people who studies and research and books and lectures I link to on social media. The goal is always to try to make sure that people know that whatever they found informative and helpful in my words, that they have a source, and that source is overwhelmingly black and brown wisdom. I may put it together a certain way that's unique to me, and some of my personal story is obviously my personal story, but the real foundational work is black and brown work. And that means I'm glad that people buy my books, but they got to buy books by black and brown authors. And I'm glad people come to my talks, but they got to go to talks by black and brown speakers. And I'm glad that they watch my videos on YouTube, but they got to do the same thing. You know, it's about making sure that we're spreading the wealth both financially, but also in terms of attention, trying to make sure that folks are getting heard and getting access. But it's absolutely true that I have amplification because of this aesthetic. The first question. So I think that certainly the personal story piece is part of the answer to that. And I also think that, I'm trying to remember exactly how you phrased the question. Can you phrase it again for me, because I want to make sure I answer it?
Yes, I think I said, you know, just around people who think they've been converted, right?
I think the best way to reach folks, so like when I'm talking to those folks, and this will be a little different advice from what the exact advice I'm going to give you, because as a woman of color, this would be a different approach, maybe would have to be required. With me, when I'm talking with other white progressive and liberal people about how far they still have to go, for me, the best place to start is by being, again, radically transparent and humble about my own mistakes in the work, right? About all the things that I didn't see, that I thought I saw. About all the times that I dropped the ball, screwed up, did something to undermine my intentions, right? And I've got plenty of those stories. And they always happen. You know, we screw up all the time.